So the topic for this evening is whose responsibility is food waste? We're going to hear from a couple of speakers this evening. B Brown from Cambridge Sustainable Food is going to demonstrate and talk to us a little bit about the tools that we developed for our zero carbon campaign, Food for Our Future, which is all about encouraging individuals and households to reduce their food waste. And then we've got Brian Milnes from South Cambs District Council, and he's going to talk to us about the role of the policymaker. That will be followed by some breakout groups where you'll get the opportunity to get to grips with a couple of thorny questions we've posed for you this evening. So time is quite tight. We only have an hour, so we're going to bit of a gallop through. So if you could keep your microphones off, and if you have any questions, we'll try and pick them up at the end of the session. So you can pop them in the chat, or if you have any information or comments you just want to let people know, pop them in the chat as well. We are going to record the session, so if you don't want to be recorded, please turn your video off, and if you right click left click on your image, you will be able to change your name or rename yourself, so you can just take your name out. We're not going to be using the video for anything other than writing a blog post and capturing what people have said. Okay, so let's get started. I work for Cambridge Sustainable Food. Cambridge Sustainable Food is a community interest company. We have been in existence for the past 5 years, and we sit underneath a national umbrella called Sustainable Food Places, which is run by Sustain and the Soil Association. There's a network of cities. We were one of the earliest signed up. We have generally worked within Cambridge City itself, but I have been doing more and more work out in the county and finding county partners, including South Cambs, to work alongside. We have a bronze level award and are galloping towards our silver this year, hopefully, and then on to gold. And to give you an idea, it's a pretty tough system to get through, and there's only 2 cities in the UK with a gold award, and as you probably would expect or know, that would be Brighton and Bristol. The next slide just gives, I'm not going to go into this in any detail, but it just gives you, I think, the scope of the work that we, and the ambition that we have in our work, which is the whole food system. So everything, and most recently of the past year, we've been working a lot with the in the food poverty realm. Obviously, there's been, given the pandemic, there's been a lot of people that have needed assistance over the past year. But we're also exceptionally committed to tackling the climate and nature emergencies, and this is where the food waste issue sits with us. We work with businesses, we work with local communities, we work with local authorities, we work with policymakers, we'll work with anybody we can, and who will work with us to promote sustainable food. So most recently, we've been running the Zero Carbon Communities campaign, and that is very much in 2 parts. Part 2 is to come later on this year, but part 1 was about reducing food waste with residents. Now, obviously, we've had to take the Food for Future campaign online, which B will take us through some of those tools. It's been a learning experience to take everything online, as I'm sure everybody will appreciate and has had to do themselves over the past year. Previous campaigns that we have run have included campaigns to do with Love Food, Hate Waste, the Sainsbury's Waste Less, Save More campaign a couple of years ago, obviously Zero Carbon Communities, and some of the activities that we've undertaken with that has been things such as we did a punt stump where we filled a monthly, an annual households waste into a punt, and yes, had lots of media attention around there. We run the Pumpkin Festival in Cambridge, which attracts over 3,000 visitors, and that's very much inviting the whole community to get involved. It usually happens around October, and as you know, that lots of pumpkin goes to waste around that time. So lots of children's activities, fringe activities, and a sort of a showcase piece of a farmer's market. We've done Ready Steady Cook, surplus food with some local celebrity chefs, which was some of the most fun I've ever had. And we've also run the Taste Not Waste campaign with local businesses. And it was a campaign to help businesses measure their food waste through using a method, a toolkit developed by RAP. So we also, alongside that, we're encouraging businesses to start recycling their food waste and to adopt food waste policies as best practice. And some of the successes out of that campaign was Selwyn College reduced their plate waste by 12%. Cambridge Cookery School became the first city's zero food waste cafe. And at Smokeworks, they measured their food waste and the food that came off people's plates that was wasted. And they discovered that 64% of the food that was put on that plate was going into the bin. So as a result, they changed, they did some behaviour change, and they changed the way in which they operated, doing things like different portion sizes for one, optional sort of things like straws or side dishes, so that people could build their own plate, as it were, rather than being given a whole big plate of food. And the Cllrs, who started composting in their restaurant gardens to feed their vegetable patches, which in turn feeds their restaurant. Food waste policies were adopted by 6 businesses: Cambridge Cookery School, Edge Cafe, Selwyn College, Sydney Sussex, and Novi. So no strangers to food waste. And for me, there's some common themes or some common issues that sort of that seem to jump out at me or transcend across all of these sort of projects that we've run in the past, including this latest one, which is zero carbon communities. And it's, you can see them here on the right, and it's not rocket science, but some of the issues are about how do you engage people, how do you engage people, and then how do you really measure how people have changed their habits. People find it difficult to invest their time and sometimes their money into making those changes that are really needed. Some of the successes, the media seems to love food waste, and I think that's a fantastic opportunity, is to get it into the media and press as much as possible. But people tell us on an individual case-by-case basis that actually they have changed, and what the stuff that they've engaged with has had a meaning for them. Community fridges seem to be flavour of the year, and there's a great national network of fridges run by Hubbub. And for those of you who don't know, community fridges are about using surplus or gathering surplus food from businesses and from individual households, putting them in a fridge and then allowing anybody who wants to take that food out of those fridges and use it. For us, businesses seem to have the deeper engagement rather than individuals in anything that we have run, and have made some of the biggest changes. And that, I think, is for a few reasons. One of them, obviously, is that they can see the benefit in terms of money returned and the savings. Plus, it is great publicity. And one of the other great successes that's come out of the past year is the network that has been set up in Cambridge around surplus food redistribution. We administrate a WhatsApp group. WhatsApp seems to be the way in which people organise these days, but the WhatsApp group of about 40 organisations and agencies who are sharing any surplus food that they might have around and in amongst themselves. So that's sort of the background, as it were, to our work and what we do. So the question, and it is a bit of a false dichotomy, but it's a starting point, I guess, and in a way it sort of feeds into narratives around what food waste is and whose responsibility is it. We hear a lot about individual responsibility for food waste, and looking at these figures, we can see that actually the amount of food waste that comes out of households in the UK surpasses the food waste by industry. What we do know, though, is a third of all greenhouse gas emissions come from the food industry, which is staggering. But we know, knowing that households outstrip in terms of wastage more than industry, knowing exactly what's going on though within those households and what the barriers are to behaviour change is really elusive. It can be really elusive. It can be really difficult to really understand what influences people's behaviour over a long period. It's fine to engage people through a campaign or a challenge for a week or two, but how do we know that that's really hit the mark 5 years later, a year later, 10 years later? I don't know whether any of you are in public health, but if I talk to any public health colleagues about behaviour change, they'll tell you that behaviour change happens very slowly. It happens over generations, tens of years, and not just within days or weeks. So the work that we do now is difficult to measure, and yet who knows what the collective impact is of all the different campaigns and awareness raising initiatives that we do now will have down the line. Something I noticed that came out this week, so recently, the Independent ran an article that highlights that one French supermarket outperforms the whole sector in the UK. So this is sort of looking at it from the other angle, not just about individuals, but so data obtained from Carrefour. Everybody hopefully is, well, most people have heard of Carrefour. It's the second largest supermarket in France. Shows that in 2020 they've donated nearly 31 tonnes of food from their French supermarkets. And that exceeded all the donations from UK supermarkets by about 6,000 tonnes. And that's mainly due to legislation and policy introduced in France in 2016. And that offers tax breaks, incentives and legislation to discourage the dumping of edible food. And I think that's a distinction that's worth drawing out when we talk about food waste. Some of it's edible, some of it isn't. And really, what we do with both of those sort of two categories is key, I think. So in the UK, I mean, and Brian, hopefully you're going to cover this a bit more, and correct me if I'm wrong. I am no expert in this field, but the UK government does very little to intervene in the donation of surplus food, so that food that is edible. And the lack of legislation and policy, I was quite shocked to hear, it's been highlighted during the pandemic. So the government subsidised the purchasing of £10.5 million worth of food through the charity Fair Share, when we could have, if legislation had been different in terms of donating surplus food, we might have been in a better prepared situation, and that food going into landfill as rather than the £10.5 million being spent on new food. So I think I'm going to wrap up. We can't solve the climate emergency, I don't feel, without a real overhaul of the whole of the food supply chain. And that means impacting behaviour change, legislation, land use, and yes, 30% of agricultural land that is grown on, the food is you might as well bin that food, because that's what happens to it. So that's the amount that doesn't get eaten. So 30% of the agricultural land that we grow crops on globally. Anyway, thanks. If you have any questions or comments or information, then please drop them in the chat, and we'll see what time we have left at the end. I'm going to introduce you to Bea now, who developed the online campaign tools for the Zero Carbon Communities Food for Our Future campaign. As I've mentioned, we weren't able to run this campaign face to face with people. We would love to, and a lot of our work is often around running stalls and festivals and cookalongs and community meals and all those sort of really fun things that we're all itching to get out and do again. But she's made a great job, and I'd like to thank her right now for taking on such a huge challenge of actually pivoting so fast from delivering face to face to delivering online. Yeah, it certainly was a huge challenge. So thanks, Bea.
Thank you, Sam. Thanks. As Sam mentioned, we ran the campaign to support local communities in South Cambs reducing their carbon footprint, and this part of the campaign tackled reducing the food that they waste. So over 4 weeks in November, we asked people to sign up to an online challenge, and we used our website pages to offer different tips and recipes, and we emailed the participants every week, encouraging them to try a different food habit, a food waste reducing habit each week. So including things like using the freezer more and using a shopping list when going out shopping. So simple tools like that. And each week we suggested a new habit. Thank you, Sam. Next. And so for our launch event, we hosted an online screening of the film Just Eat It, a food waste story by Canadian filmmakers Grant Baldwin and Jen Rustmayer. And it's a really great film. It's won lots of awards. We were really delighted to share it with the guests at the launch. And we followed the film with a discussion around sustainability with local speakers, including Brian. Thank you, Brian, back again tonight. And the guests really enjoyed the evening. We had some really good feedback. People found it quite thought-provoking and informative. And even though the film's a few years old, I think the message is still very much is unchanged. Next. So we also hosted some live cookalongs using Zoom, which was great because it allowed people to kind of have a real sense of socializing together, enjoying cooking together and talking about food waste and recipes. Even though we couldn't be together, it kind of felt like a social event, which was great. Just before Halloween, we had a cook-along for families using pumpkins. So something like 12 million pumpkins get wasted every Halloween. So James Shepherd from the Let's Cook project did a fabulous cook-along using lots of pumpkins. So we did some smoky baked beans with grated pumpkin inside, and also some pumpkin muffins, which were great. And then Rosie Sykes, who's another local food writer and local chef, she also used lots of pumpkin, but she also made bread and butter pudding, which was really popular. And we waste something like 20 million slices every day. So it was a fantastic recipe for using up stale bread. And she also made some pumpkin and split pea bulgur wheat, which was really delicious. And finally, we had another cook along, which we asked participants of the challenge to send in a shelfie, which is something that WRAP started, the idea of taking a photograph of your fridge before you go shopping. But we asked people to send what was lurking in their fridge drawer, and the chefs Lucy Robinson and Hilary Caccio came up with some great recipe ideas, including using up leftover cauliflower leaves, which was fantastic. Next. Thank you, Sam. So we felt it was important to include children in the Food for Our Future campaign. We know that children can have a positive impact on their parents' behaviour. So we went out to the Histon allotment and we recorded 2 environmental stories there. So Compost Stew and Don't Waste Your Food, which are 2 really great books for kids. So we read them aloud, we recorded them, and we met a couple of the creatures of the compost down there. So Woody the woodlouse and Cedric the centipede made an appearance. And we were also kindly given an interview by John Kay, who's a sort of guru, compost guru from the allotment. And he gave us an interview on all things compost. So all of these videos are available on our YouTube channel, which I will put a link to in the chat. And I think we have one more slide, Sam. Yeah, so we also had, during each week of the challenge, we shared a new cookery demo from one of our local chefs who generously supported the campaign with their time and their recipes. So we asked them to each pick a sort of commonly wasted item. So James, again, bread featured, but he made, using stale breadcrumbs, made what's known in Italy as poor man's parmesan, so pan grattato, which is a really great way to use up stale bread. Leo from Jack's Gelato chose to share a recipe for a lockdown favourite. It's become a lockdown favourite, banana bread. So he made some muffins, which is a great recipe again, and they're all available online. So I will share a link to those in the chat. Thank you, Sam.
Thank you, Bea. Fantastic. Please do use those resources. And if you want links, or you want more information, or if you want to embed them in your own websites, do just give us a shout. So I'd like to bring us on to looking at the role of the policymaker. Thanks, Brian, for being with us. Councillor Brian Milnes was elected to South Cambs District Council in May 2018, becoming part of the new Lib Dem group that formed the new administration. He's been a major contributor to the formation and enactment of new council policies, including Green to the Core. And last year became a cabinet member, taking responsibility for environmental services and licensing. Brian, welcome. Brian's going to try and, in 10 minutes, investigate the barriers facing policymakers and how we overcome those barriers, and how can we make wasting food as acceptable as something like littering or non-recycling. Take it away, Brian. Thank you.
So would you like to close my slide down? Because I'm sort of wanting to wave my arms around in a Magnus Pike sort of way, and I've brought along a visual aid.
Absolutely. There we go.
Thank you. I'll come back to those in a moment. So yeah, unusually, I was explaining to Sam and Bea earlier, I don't really think of myself as a politician yet. I only joined a political party in 2015 and rather accidentally stood for election and got elected 3 years or so ago. So, but it is interesting that I'm now effectively one of the policymakers that you've been asking about. And so let's talk about legislation, because Sam mentioned legislation. I've got a rather old and tatty document here, which is the government's white paper on waste resources and their strategy for England. Unfortunately, it's been delayed by 6 months. But within there's a lot of good talk. And I'm not going to uncover his face, but Michael Gove is in there. so I'll leave him covered up. But actually, he came up with some very good suggestions, or at least his team did. There's a lot of reference, for example, to circular economy, which is a phrase that is still new to many in the population. And this is a critical part, I believe, of raising the awareness of all of these issues. I don't think until fairly recently I was aware that a third of the food that we produce in the world goes to waste. It doesn't get consumed. This is an astonishing figure, that actually we're producing 50% more food than we consume. So, you know, the awareness of that, this is why the value of these, we're on Food Waste Action Week this week. But that is good. It's good news that we're raising awareness and actually feeding back into policy, doing it evidence-based wise. We've heard a lot of figures tonight about how much waste we're producing. You know, 15 to 25% of our shopping, our food shopping, is wasted. That's an awful lot of money that we're spending on not consuming stuff. So, you know, if we add that to the 20% of the food that's left behind in the field, has anybody been gleaning? I've done it a couple of times. It's great fun, and it's like for free. This is great news. And the farmers leave it behind. We have a few locally. I did go online to see there's a gleaning organisation, and the nearest ones I could find locally were Peterborough and Chelmsford. So if you're particularly interested, I'm sure they would love volunteers locally to organise gleaning clubs. And what a great idea! What a great idea for the kids. Take them out into the fields and get free food. I think that's a lovely idea. So this is all about the awareness of the problem and how we might fix it. The fact that this food waste, I think Sam already mentioned, is a major contribution to greenhouse gases. So it's directly feeding into the climate change we're suffering from. I was at a meeting earlier this week, which was reviewing the flood situation that we had locally in Cambridge in December and January. In fact, you may remember Storm Bella, but she didn't deposit as much as she threatened to locally. And yet we still had the third worst flooding on record, or the third highest amount of rainfall. Fortunately, it was over a longer period and didn't cause the devastation that it could, but some places were badly affected. So more and more people are becoming aware of the direct consequences of climate change. And talking about water, this is where the potatoes are going to make a show. I don't know. Does anybody know how many cubic meters of water go into a ton of potatoes? It's a huge amount, and we grow quite a lot of potatoes here. So so 22 cubic meters per ton of potatoes. But when I was peeling these potatoes, I looked at the thing and thought, what's this? It's a little less than perfect potatoes. These are ugly vegetables, but look, they're lovely and tasty. And that's the sort of thing we need to do. So good on Waitrose, you know, they're selling, and they say, where is it? Yes, helping to reduce food waste. So it's part of the collaboration between government, local authorities, volunteer groups, is to feed into that awareness, make it a thing. Who knew how devastating the plastic in our society was to our oceans and our food chain until David Attenborough came along and told us how bad it was. Some of us might have known beforehand, but that was certainly a big part of bringing it into public awareness. Hugh Fearnley Whittingstall has already done some very good work on food waste. You'll have seen some of his programs. That's part of it. It's going and shaming the supermarkets for the waste that they encourage. The example of Carrefour in France is remarkable, isn't it? That by a combination of willingness and legislation, they've produced a massive turnaround of what they do with their food waste. So we've got to encourage our supermarkets to do the same, while ever there's a lack of legislation to encourage them to do it, and then encourage our legislators to make sure that they add their bit to the equation. So it's combination, isn't it? There's always been a tension between persuasion and prohibition. And we may need to do like we have with many things like smoking and seatbelt wearing. We've had to do a combination of those things. And the waste food that we're producing, there's a hierarchy of needs for that stuff. So the first, it has to feed people, then it has to feed animals, and then it has to feed energy, and then it has to feed compost. And finally, if there's absolutely no alternative, do a bit of landfill. But that's what we need to make sure people understand is the process. So I think the lack of awareness is the key barrier, and the improving awareness is the task that we need to take on board. And there's actually good news in here. Going back to my bag of very lovely potatoes, they were cheaper. I saved money by buying ugly vegetables. So save money while saving the planet's not a bad little idea, is it? So that's where I'm coming from. I'm more than happy to take any questions, but I've probably done my time and a little bit over, so thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Brian. If there are any questions, then we can come back to them towards the end if we have time. So now it's over to you lot. And I'm just going to share my screen again to show you the questions that we have prepared. Maybe I can copy them, drop them in the chat as well, so you've still got okay, so here's the Trixie questions I prepared earlier. Could you try and copy them and put them in the chat? I don't know whether that will work.
Yeah, that's fine. I'll do that.
Okay, thank you. And then you'll be able to see them as well, because I'll move away from the screen in a minute. So we have two questions here. As I said before, it is a bit of a false dichotomy to say, is it legislators or is it the individual responsibility? But I also think these are useful questions to ask. So what barriers do individuals and households face when reducing food waste, and how can their behaviour change happen? So this can be things that you find, Trixie, at home difficult, but also maybe if you work in this sector, what are the real issues at a household level, and how do we get over those barriers? The second question is, what should the role of policymakers and legislators be? What does policy and legislation look like for a zero food waste society? How much intervention is needed, and where and how? We're going to split you into groups. So please feel free to answer one or both, or to chuck them out entirely and talk about something that is of more interest. What I would like to ask though is that there's somebody in the group that can feed back at the end of the session. So maybe feedback to things your group felt was important, or that they'd just like to convey to everybody else, and that can be around legislation, policy making, behaviour change, or something else that comes out your discussions. So can I ask for one person from each group to give us a really brief, quick summary of your discussions? Who would like to go first? Go on, Alison, thank you. You're on mute.
Okay, now I'm unmuted. Right, yes, so in our small group, we looked mostly at the first question, which was around behaviour change and what individuals, what barriers individuals and households have. And one of the things we focused on was children. We felt that they weren't perhaps being taught enough in schools. You know, there's cookery lessons that may happen, but there's certainly a lot more learning that could be undertaken in schools and from a younger age. So rather than perhaps just cooking lessons in senior school, what about kids learning about where their food comes from the age of 5, 6? So that's something we thought might be important. We also realised that another barrier is actually income. And one thing we touched on was that there's an Eat Well plate that the government post on their website that looks at what a typical person or child should be eating and how many people can afford to buy such a plate of food. And that the number of people that could afford that is actually reducing. So that's not good. Income and affordability is a big barrier. And of course, time and convenience as well, with families having lots of conflicting priorities, especially at the moment, if you're juggling home and work, and maybe you're being self-employed, or maybe you're employed by someone else, maybe both. Maybe you're trying to homeschool kids, or you have kids unexpectedly at home who might be at nursery. Maybe you know, just life with various things and priorities. It can be difficult to find the time to cook a meal from scratch. So that was something that we thought about. And one idea that was suggested was perhaps supermarkets could have a vegetable of the week or something, or some way of focusing on a particular food that recipes could then be suggested from there. But yes, there's certainly a lot of barriers, and we could have talked for a lot longer.
Thank you, Alison. Thank you very, very much. Yeah, some great points. Okay, who would like to go next? Come on, someone has to.
I nominate Emma from our group.
There we go. Emma.
Still on mute.
Unmute. I'm unmuted now. Wasn't letting me do it. Hi. Okay, so you've covered quite a bit on that one, actually. I think in addition to that, I think we sort of touched on, you know, back to children, and you know, children don't necessarily eat everything on their plate, so there's a lot of, you know, wastage there, and you can't force your children to eat a particular meal. And I don't want to eat leftovers all the time, you know, dog might not want it, or things like that. So freezing is quite a good thing to do. If you could, you know, perhaps think about what you could freeze, even the things that you've cooked. You might have made a meal, but even things like bananas and things you can freeze, and certain, you know, fruit that you can actually freeze itself. And it'd be useful to have lists of what you can and what you can't, and obviously people can find that, but I think it needs to be sort of made simple for people, because you know, there's time again, you know, time is the big thing that we were talking about earlier, and time, you know, not everybody's got time. So what else did we talk about? I'm just trying to think. We didn't actually sort of touch much on the second sort of question, but that was mainly for the first question. Brian, is there anything that I've missed on that one? I was trying to think. I mean,
I think the only thing I'd add to that was the planning and helping people work out what they needed to go and buy before they went and bought it, because that's really where it's in the purchasing of the stuff, because people are buying more than they need. They then don't necessarily store it properly. I mean, we chuck most of our 2 weekly shops straight in the freezer, as you've just mentioned, but it's because there's a plan there. And if you don't have a plan, how do you know what you're going to do with what when? but that's an education process, isn't it? You know, I think Alison talked about you know, getting the kids on board with that early doors. You know, and understanding that that's really what we need to do. Otherwise, we'll carry on doing the waste. I mean, my parents, bless them, quite a long time gone now, you know, grew up in the war, where it wasn't just an option to eat everything on the plate. You'd be going hungry if you didn't.
Yeah. I know. I need to be stricter with my children. I think I was like, you can't have your dessert until you've eaten that. But you know, after you said it about 50 times, you know, your patience wears, you know, then. So it's really, there is a balance. But talking about children, and you saying about the education of children, you know, maybe something that the eco schools could sort of, you know, I mean, I'm sure they probably do stuff on, you know, food waste, but you know, it could be incorporated more in what they do, and encouraging more schools to participate in the eco schools as well. Could be another thing.
Great, thank you. These are all fantastic ideas. I'm writing them down. Thank you, Emma. Thank you, Brian. Next group. I think maybe there's one more group. Is there? Claire. Hi, Claire.
I'm just going to volunteer because we couldn't volunteer in the breakout group. We didn't specifically answer the questions, but our comments ranged. First of all, barriers to donating surplus food. For example, food banks, some of them only take tin goods rather than fresh goods. Potential lack of knowledge about where to donate surplus food, lack of connectivity between individuals who have excess that's potentially going to go off quite quickly and people who can use it. People not seeing the value of food because they're removed from the process of producing food. It's quite easy and can often be too cheap to go to a supermarket and buy packaged food that has very little value to a family. Whereas if you produce it yourself and you've put the work in to grow the vegetables in your own garden, you're not going to let it go to waste very easily because you know what went the work behind it. And lack of knowledge within households of how to use odds and ends. For example, you know, how to make your own stock, or how those recipes you mentioned sounded really good about how to use up the stale bits of bread or the end slices that a lot of the kids don't want to eat and things like that. So lack of knowledge of how to use up scraps and things that might easily go in the compost bin. I think that was, I might have missed anything, so anybody else can chip in from our group that if I've missed something.
Thank you so much, Claire. Brilliant. Thank you. Does anybody else have anything they want to add? Catherine.
I just wanted to add something Michael said, that he is trying to encourage people to reduce their waste. And Michael, you said something about you set a challenge and how much carbon mileage you could rack up making a meal. And I think that's a really fun way of looking at it, because I'm reading a book with my son at the moment that's about carbon and it having to be restricted. So he was upset by the concept of reducing to you eat 2 hours a day, and I was like, I think that COVID is probably more difficult than that really at the moment. But I think that's a really interesting way of making things fun, making it a positive experience. I think that from my perspective, if you make this into an educational and positive experience, that you're involved and engaged in what you're eating, then people will take to it, rather than making it into a like you've got to suffer, because it's not really. It's much more mindful. If you turn it into a mindfulness exercise, when it's about well-being, I think that's yeah, a really positive way forwards. But I think policy obviously needs to kind of counteract that. So for instance, the big thing I noticed about moving to South Cambridgeshire is the fact we have a green bin. And if you've got a green bin, then you're going to think about where the waste goes. And if you open up that question, then hopefully, if people have the time, if they're not overworked and, you know, overstressed, then there is going to be more consideration, because the environment really lends itself to that. Whereas in places like central London, it doesn't lend itself to thinking about where waste goes because of the way that everything is structured. Yeah, so, you know, those opportunities to use wormeries and to build your own compost pits. I think scientifically that's an interesting process, but yeah, I think, I mean, personally, I'm really into this idea of compost, and I think theoretically it's a wonderful idea. So it's tapping into that. I'll stop there.
Thank you. Fantastic, Catherine. That's fantastic. And yes, you're absolutely correct. Fun and making it a positive experience will always engage people more than finger wagging and telling them they mustn't do things. So yes, it's always being mindful of that when we're talking to others. We are run out of time. Does anybody have any sort of very pressing questions that they might like to ask Brian or myself or B? Obviously, you can get in touch with us outside of this, and well, I'm offering Brian Brian's time, but you can contact myself or B at any time. I think these dropped our contact.
Sort of goes with the territory that people can contact me if they'd like
contact Brian. So unless there's any sort of burning questions, I think we'll wrap it up there. Thank you so much for coming along. Great to see you, and I hope to see you or work with some of you again in the near future. Thank you. All right, have a good evening. Bye.